So they, and the Cheyennes are at Lame Deer, which is in Montana. But they still have their reservations. And so they're their homelands, although I have to tell you that the Arapahoes today still think of Colorado, the plains of Colorado. These are their homelands. This is home to them. So I started going to those places. I went to Oklahoma, I went to the Wind River Reservation. I began to get to know the people. I had the chance to meet and begin to talk with some of the elders. Some of these people that I talked with in the 1970s, they were in their 90s. So just think how far back they went. They had firsthand stories of what it was like in the old time, as they call it, when they lived free on the plains. And they talked about Sand Creek. They spoke of Sand Creek as if it had happened yesterday. And I had the feeling while I was talking to these wonderful old people that I was just really touching history. And of course, all the time I was doing this, people would say to me, "You're writing about what? What? Who? You're writing about an obscure Indian chief that nobody cares about? You're writing about Sand Creek? What's that?" And then they would say, "Well, you'll never get that published." I had so many people tell me that it just fired me up, you know. I began to think, well, you watch me. And I just kept going. So as I kept going, gradually, the narrative of Left Hand's life and times began to emerge. And here was the narrative. He was not a simple man. He was a complicated man with conflicts. He was a man of peace who was a war chief. A man thrust into a changing world, and yet a man of his own time and his culture. He was a Plains Indian, an Arapaho who spoke English fluently, who understood white men. He tried to make peace with white people, and yet he at the same time, he was leading his warriors out to hunt the buffalo, to protect their own hunting grounds from other tribes, to protect their villages, to raid horses. Horses were necessary for life. So all the time he was talking peace, he was out on raids because he was a war chief. Why did he speak English fluently? Because a white man by the name of John Poisal, who was a trader, who worked out at Bent's Fort down on the Arkansas River near La Junta, married Left Hand's sister, Mayham, her name was, which means snake woman, and he began living in the village with the Arapaho people. Left Hand was young at the time, and he took Left Hand under his wing, and he taught him to speak English. The head Arapaho chief at the time was Hosa, who is Little Raven. He did not speak English. So Left Hand became the interpreter and his closest confidant and his advisor. It was Left Hand who was interacting with the white authorities out here who came out here on the plains after the gold rush. And not only on behalf of the Arapahoes, but on behalf of the Cheyennes as well. The gold rush in 1858 in the fall brought 35,000 white men here. Women came later, so at first it was men. And the real gold rush, the following spring in 1859, brought 150,000 people here, men mostly. The Arapahoes and the Cheyennes together, on a good day, could muster about 6,000 or 7,000 people. They were inundated. They said all the white men in existence had come to the plains. They said there couldn't be any more. They're all here. They said it shocked their minds. So just imagine that. Left Hand was a practical man. He realized there was no way his people could drive these newcomers out of this land. So he devoted himself to try to find a way that two cultures, the Indian culture that was here and the white culture that was moving in here, could live together on this vast land. He was comfortable with white people, having grown up with a white man. So he did all kinds of things to interact with the white people on the plains. He went to the Rocky Mountain News. After the Rocky Mountain News had printed a story that was derogatory of the Arapahoes, he did not read, But he had a lot of white friends he spoke with and talked with, and so obviously one of them must have mentioned to him this article that had appeared in the Rocky Mountain News. He went to the Rocky Mountain News, and he demanded a retraction from William Byers, who was the editor, and he explained to him what had actually happened. And the interesting thing about this is William Byers believed him, and William Byers printed his story and said, this is what happened. He took his word over the word of a white man who had given him a different story. He took some of his warriors and went to see a play at the Apollo Theater on Larimer Street. And after the play was over, he jumped up on the stage and he gave a speech. And basically what he said was, as you have come here looking for gold, take your gold and leave us our lands. Go home and leave us our lands. But they weren't going to do that. They weren't going home because they were finding gold and they intended to find more gold. He visited settlers in the area, especially around Boulder. He brought his band there to camp in the wintertime. He really liked the Boulder area. And he visited settlers around Niwot, what became Niwot, Haystack Mountain, and he would spend time with them, talking with them about ways in which these two cultures could work together and how he could work with the authorities in Denver. He met with those authorities, with Territorial Governor John Evans, and with John Shivington, Colonel John Shivington, who was in charge of the military district in Colorado. He worked for peace through negotiation by talking. He was one of the peace chiefs, as was Little Raven and the Cheyenne chiefs Black Kettle and White Antelope. But the young warriors, they called them the talking chiefs, because while they were talking, things just kept getting worse and worse. The buffalo were being scattered and slaughtered, and of course they depended for their lives on the buffalo. And the people were being driven about, they were being killed, children were getting ill with so many diseases, they were hungry. It was a disaster. And so these young warriors wanted to take matters into their own hands. And they began to do that by attacking the settlers, by attacking the wagon trains coming across the plains, stealing horses and stealing the cattle. By 1863, the Indian lands that legally belonged to the Cheyennes and Arapahoes were in the hands of outsiders. Towns, ranches, wagon stations were being built all over the Indian lands. The buffalo was being destroyed and dispersed, and it was getting more and more difficult for the warriors to feed their people. And most of the time, when they were stealing cattle, it was to feed their people. However, the military then that was here would march their troops out. They would indiscriminately attack whatever village they came upon. They would kill the people and destroy the village, regardless of whether the warriors in that village had been responsible for what they called depredations. So at one point in 1864, the warriors had actually cut off the overland trail, and that was the trail along the Platte River. Now, this area out here, the settlers here, were totally dependent upon getting food and goods, clothing, everything from the east. So with the overland trail cut off, they were isolated. So it was a very, very tough situation. And while the peace chiefs are talking, trying to work something out, of course, they were trying to keep their own warriors in check. And they were redoubling their efforts to do that while they tried to bring about a peace treaty. Finally, in September of 1864, the peace chiefs were escorted to Denver by a very good man, by a man who really believed in them and believed in peace, and believed peace could be worked out here on the plains. He brought them to Denver to meet with Colonel Shivington, and especially to meet with Governor Evans to work out a peace agreement. Governor Evans refused to meet them after they'd come some 400 miles in wagons. He refused to meet with them. And Edward Wynkoop said, "I've given them my word you will meet with them." And he said, "We're not leaving Denver until you do." So he forced Evans to finally meet with them. They met at Camp Weld, and there they told the peace chiefs, go to and put yourselves under the protection of the military at Fort Lyons. Fort Lyons was down on the Arkansas River near Bent's Fort. And we will make a peace agreement with you. And so they did that. They went to Fort Lyon. The commanders there told them to go out and camp along Sand Creek, which was about 40 miles away, so that their warriors could go out and get game to feed the people. So they did that. And they thought that they were waiting for a peace agreement to be worked out. So as Chief Left Hand's story unfolded, I could see where it was heading, and it was heading into this horrific black tornado that was Sand Creek. And on November 29th of 1864, Colonel Shivington, after they had, and they say this is in the records, after we had the Indians corralled, they say, they marched down there. Colonel Shivington led the 3rd Colorado Regiment. They were called the 100 Daysers because they had been called up to fight Indians for 100 days. And they were also known as the Bloodless Third because they hadn't actually gotten around to fighting any Indians. They were civilians. They were mostly miners. Most of them listed their occupations as miners. They had no military training. They had no uniforms. They had no discipline. And they were led by an untrained officer, Colonel John Shivington, and he found himself, I'm sure much to his surprise, in command of the military district of Colorado for one reason, and that's because the regular troops and the regular officers had been called east to fight in the Civil War. So that left out here the untrained militia. And when Shivington got to Fort Lyon, he coerced, there were some regular troops still at Fort Lyon, and he coerced them into joining him to attack these Indians at Sand Creek. Even though their officers remonstrated with him and said, no, we can't do that, they are under our protection. And Shivington said he would shoot any man who refused to fight Indians. So about 600 to 700 men under Shivington marched overnight 40 miles to Sand Creek. Camped at Sand Creek, there were about 600 Cheyennes under Black Kettle and White Antelope, and 60 Arapahoes under Left Hand. The main group of Arapahoes under Little Raven, they were on their way to Sand Creek. They hadn't gotten there yet. They were still on their way. And most of the people there were women and children and old people because most of the warriors had gone out to find game to feed the people. So at dawn, Shivington opened the attack on a sleeping camp, and they surrounded the camp and they started shooting at anyone who moved, men, children, old people. And of course, these people had believed themselves under the protection of the military. They put up what defense they could. The attack went on for hours, and at the end, Shivington and his troops gathered up all the Indian belongings, the teepees, the clothing, the food supplies, and burned them. And the flames burned all during the night. In my book, I say there were about 160 Indians who died there, because at that time, when I was doing the research, that's what the Cheyennes had believed, the number that had been killed. But now, further research, historians believe now that there are about 200 Indians who were killed there. All of the Arapahoes were wiped out. All of the people under Left Hand, that included his whole family. There were only 2 or 3 survivors among the Arapahoes. There were many wounded among the Indians. And they were able to, some of them were able to escape onto the plains. It was a really bitter, cold night, and they eventually made their way to a large Sioux camp. There were 7 or 8 soldiers killed and a few wounded. So it was a rout. It was just a rout. Left Hand was there. However, historians, when I started researching this in the 1970s, historians had been arguing ever since 1864 about what happened to Left Hand at Sand Creek. And some of the historians said, well, he was killed there. But Shivington himself had said, and he knew Left Hand, he said his body was not on the site, was not found. Other historians said, oh, no, he survived. And he went on to Oklahoma, and he resumed leadership of his people down there. Well, the interesting thing is that there was, in the 1870s, a very great man, a chief, an Arapaho chief in Oklahoma by the name of Left Hand. And in many ways, he was similar to the Left Hand here in Colorado. So I ended up,